Imagine a legendary figure, a guitar god whose music transcended boundaries and defined generation. Now, picture him in a place where individuality is suppressed, creativity stifled, and conformity is king: the military. This is the untold story of Jimi Hendrix, a chapter of his life that almost crushed the very spirit that would later ignite the world. What if the most electrifying performer in rock history never got the chance to plug in? What if the uniform silenced the guitar? Before we dive into this incredible journey, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know your city and country in the comments below. And if you're as fascinated by the hidden stories of rock legends as I am, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single beat of our upcoming tales. The year was 1961, and the vibrant hum of Seattle was a stark contrast to the rigid order Jimi Hendrix was about to encounter. Long before the kaleidoscopic explosion of Monterey pop or the muddy fields of Woodstock, James Marshall Hendrix was simply a young man, restless and brimming with an unarticulated energy. His childhood had been a tumultuous tapestry of poverty, neglect, and a deep yearning for stability, a craving that paradoxically led him to the most structured environment imaginable, the United States Army. It wasn't a choice born of fervent patriotism, but rather a stark ultimatum. A run-in with the law over stolen cars presented him with two options: prison or the military. For a 19-year-old with a guitar-shaped dream brewing beneath the surface, the latter seemed like a lesser evil, a temporary detour on the road to something greater. Little did he know, this detour would test his resolve in ways he could never have anticipated. His enlistment in the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was a world away from the smoky clubs and impromptu jam sessions he yearned for. The rhythmic strumming of a guitar was replaced by the relentless cadence of marching boots, the improvisational freedom of a blues riff by the unyielding discipline of military drills. Fort Campbell, Kentucky became his new reality, a sprawling base where every action was dictated, every moment accounted for. The vibrant colors of his imagination were dulled by the drab olive green of his uniform, and the cacophony of rock and roll was drowned out by the barked orders of drill sergeants. Jimi, ever the free spirit, found himself chafing under the strictures. His long hair, a natural rebellion, was forcibly shorn, and his unconventional approach to life clashed repeatedly with the military's emphasis on conformity. He was an artist trapped in a soldier's body, and the internal conflict was palpable. The irony was not lost on him. The very institution designed to forge men into disciplined units struggled to contain the raw, untamed talent simmering within him. While his peers focused on rifle drills and tactical maneuvers, Jimi's mind often drifted to chord progressions and lyrical ideas. He would snatch moments of solitude, retreating to quiet corners of the barracks with his worn acoustic guitar, its melodies a clandestine rebellion against the imposed silence. These stolen moments were his lifeline, a desperate attempt to keep the flame of his musical passion alive amidst the oppressive winds of military life. His bunkmates often found him lost in thought, strumming softly, oblivious to the mundane conversations around him. He was present in body, but his soul was miles away, wandering through a landscape of sonic innovation. Yet, despite the inherent clash, the Army inadvertently provided Jimi with some unexpected advantages. The forced proximity with diverse individuals from across the country exposed him to new perspectives and cultural nuances, subtly enriching his understanding of humanity, a wellspring for future lyrical content. The physical discipline, though initially unwelcome, might inadvertently hone his stamina and stage presence, qualities that would later define his explosive performances. He even managed to form a band, the King Casuals, with fellow soldier Billy Cox, a bass player who would later become a lifelong friend and musical collaborator. Their jam sessions, often held in the recreation halls or during brief respites from duty, were a testament to the indomitable power of music to find a way even in the most improbable of settings. These fleeting moments of musical camaraderie were rays of sunshine piercing through the gray clouds of military routine, offering glimpses of the future that lay beyond the confines of Fort Campbell. However, the strain of military life was undeniable. Jimi's medical records from this period reveal a litany of complaints, many hinting at the psychological toll the rigid environment was taking him. He feigned various ailments from back pain to ankle injuries, anything to escape the demanding physical training and the relentless pressure to conform. Some historians suggest these were genuine manifestations of stress, while others propose they were calculated attempts to secure a medical discharge. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What is clear is that Jimi was desperate for an exit, a way back to the world where his guitar was his voice and his music his destiny. He was a square peg in a round hole, and the friction was creating an unsustainable tension. His very essence, the spontaneous, electric energy that would soon captivate millions, was being suffocated by the rigid demands of military service. The stage was set for a dramatic turning point, a moment that would determine whether the world would ever hear the genius of Jimi Hendrix. As the humid summer of 1962 settled over Fort Campbell, the friction between Jimi's internal world and his external reality reached a breaking point. To the officers of the 101st Airborne, Private Hendrix was a logistical nightmare. Reports from his superiors painted a picture of a soldier who was habitually late for formation, unable to follow simple instructions, and, perhaps most tellingly, obsessed with his guitar to the point of neglecting his duties. While his fellow paratroopers were honing their marksmanship, Jimi was often found tucked away in a supply closet or behind the barracks, coaxing strange, otherworldly sounds from his instrument. He wasn't just playing songs, he was beginning to deconstruct the very nature of sound, experimenting with feedback and distortion that would one day revolutionize the electric guitar. But in the eyes of the U.S. Army, this wasn't genius, it was a lack of discipline. The tension wasn't just about his lack of soldierly focus, it was about the psychological weight of the Screaming Eagle's lifestyle. Jimi had completed his jump training, earning his paratrooper wings, but every leap from a plane felt less like a brave military feat and more like a desperate metaphor for his own life, a free fall without a clear place to land. His relationship with his guitar, an old Dane Electro he had nicknamed Betty Jean, became his only source of comfort. He reportedly slept with it, much to the annoyance of the other men in the barracks. "I've got to keep it close," he would tell them. "It's the only thing that speaks my language." The guitar was no longer just an instrument, it was his shield against the crushing weight of the military machine. However, the military's patience was wearing thin. A series of performance reviews described Hendrix as unreliable and lacking the necessary motivation for service. It was becoming clear to everyone, including Jimi, that he was never going to be the model soldier his father, Al Hendrix, had hoped he would become. The Army wanted a weapon, Jimi wanted to be a lightning bolt. This fundamental mismatch led to a series of disciplinary actions that only deepened his resolve to find a way out. He began to lean into his reputation as a misfit, realizing that if he couldn't be the best soldier, he might as well be the most conspicuous failure. He started claiming that he was hearing voices and that the vibrations of the engines were talking to him, a tactic that some believe was a calculated move to be labeled as mentally unfit for service. Amidst this escalating conflict, his friendship with Billy Cox remained the sole beacon of sanity. They would play at the service club, blending rhythm and blues with a raw, aggressive edge that confused the local Kentucky crowds but thrilled the soldiers who were looking for an escape. Cox, a disciplined musician himself, recognized that Jimi was operating on a different frequency. He saw the way Jimi's fingers moved across the fretboard. Even then, he was playing with a fluidity and a voice that surpassed any of the seasoned professionals on the circuit. They made a pact. As soon as they were out of this green prison, they would head to Nashville and make a name for themselves. This pact was the North Star that kept Jimi moving through the muddy trenches and the cold morning roll calls. The end finally came in July 1962. The official story is that Jimi was granted a medical discharge after breaking his ankle during his 26th parachute jump. However, many biographers and former associates suggest that the broken ankle was a convenient fiction agreed upon by both Jimi and his commanding officers to facilitate an honorable exit for a soldier who simply didn't fit. His final evaluation stated, "Hendrix has no interest in the military. His only interest is the guitar." With his discharge papers in hand and his beat-up guitar case slung over his shoulder, Jimi walked away from Fort Campbell with nothing but a few dollars and a burning ambition. He was no longer Private Hendrix. He was a free man, a musician unleashed upon a world that had no idea what was coming. The Army had failed to break him, and in doing so, they had inadvertently sharpened the edge of the man who would soon set the music world on fire. The transition from the rigid barracks of Kentucky to the neon-lit uncertainty of the civilian world was a sensory explosion. With his discharge papers still crisp in his pocket, Jimi didn't head back to Seattle. He headed straight for Clarksville, Tennessee, to reunite with Billy Cox. They were broke, often sharing a single room and living on nothing but canned beans and the adrenaline of newfound freedom. They officially formed the King Casuals, and this period became Jimi's true trial by fire. This wasn't the glamorous life of a rock star, it was the grueling reality of the Chitlin circuit. They played in small, smoke-filled clubs across the South and Midwest, venues that were safe for black performers during a time of intense racial segregation. Here, Jimi learned the art of showmanship, competing with flamboyant acts that demanded more than just good playing. They demanded a spectacle. In these dimly lit juke joints, Hendrix began to develop the stage theatrics that would later make him an icon. Out of sheer necessity to stand out in a crowded room, he started playing the guitar with his teeth and behind his back. It wasn't just a gimmick, it was a way to command attention in rooms where the audience was more interested in drinking and dancing than listening. He was honing his craft as a sideman, backing up legends like Wilson Pickett and Sam Cooke. However, his burgeoning genius was already causing friction. Band leaders wanted a reliable guitarist who would stay in the background and play the arrangement exactly as written. Jimi, still fueled by the rebellious spirit that got him kicked out of the Army, couldn't help but infuse every song with wild, distorted flourishes and feedback that left his employers bewildered and often frustrated. The struggle for survival was constant. There were nights when he slept on park benches or in the back of tour buses, his guitar held tight to his chest like a wooden talisman. His clothes were often ragged, and his stomach was frequently empty, but his musical vocabulary was expanding at a dizzying pace. He was absorbing everything, the deep, soulful blues of the Mississippi Delta, the sharp, rhythmic precision of James Brown's funk, and the soaring gospel melodies he heard in Southern churches. He was becoming a human sponge, soaking up the American musical landscape and filtering it through his own unique, electrified perspective. Yet, despite his obvious talent, he remained a ghost in the industry, a musician's musician who was too wild for the mainstream and too experimental for the traditional R&B circuit. The pressure to conform hadn't vanished with the Army uniform, it had simply changed shape. Producers and agents told him he couldn't sing, that his look was too weird, and that his playing was too noisy. But the military had taught him one valuable lesson: how to survive in an environment that didn't want him. He refused to tone down his sound. He began to realize that if he wanted to play the music he heard in his head, he couldn't do it as someone else's backup player. He needed to be the center of the storm. This realization led him to New York City, the ultimate proving ground. He arrived in Harlem with nothing but his guitar and a handful of contacts, ready to gamble everything on the belief that his noise was actually the sound of the future. In New York, the struggle reached a fever pitch. He played for tips at the Café Wa in Greenwich Village, calling himself Jimi James. It was here, in the bohemian heart of the city, that he finally found an audience that didn't just tolerate his experimentation, they craved it. The folkies, the poets, and the budding rockers of the village saw something in him that the R&B circuit had missed. They saw a revolutionary. But even as he began to build a cult following, the ghost of his past followed him. The discipline he lacked in the army was now replaced by a frantic, almost desperate work ethic. He would play for 8 hours straight, his fingers bleeding, driven by the fear that if he stopped, the world would move on without him. He was standing on the precipice of greatness, but the fall to rock bottom was only a single missed gig away. By 1966, the streets of Greenwich Village were buzzing with rumors of a wild man who could make a guitar sound like a dive-bombing plane or a screaming siren. Yet, despite the local notoriety, Jimi was still living hand-to-mouth. The turning point came in the form of Linda Keith, a young woman with a sharp ear for talent and a connection to the biggest band in the world. She was the girlfriend of Keith Richards. When she first saw Jimi play at the Cheetah Club, she didn't just see a guitarist, she saw a shift in the tectonic plates of music. She tried to convince the Rolling Stones management to sign him, but they didn't get it. They saw the messy hair and the feedback as a distraction. It took a man named Chas Chandler, the bassist for the Animals, who was looking to move into management, to truly see the gold mine hidden beneath the grit. Chas Chandler made Jimi a proposition that sounded like a fever dream. Come to London and I'll make you a star. Jimi, ever the skeptic but with nothing left to lose in America, had one condition. He asked if Chas could introduce him to Eric Clapton. In Jimi's mind, if he could hold his own against the god of British guitar, he knew he had a chance. On the flight to London, Jimi was nervous. He was traveling to a country he had only seen in movies, carrying a guitar and a small bag of clothes. He didn't even have a proper coat for the English drizzle. But as soon as he landed, the energy changed. London in the mid-60s was the epicenter of the cultural universe, and Jimi Hendrix was about to become its most explosive inhabitant. Within days of his arrival, the legendary encounter with Eric Clapton took place. The band Cream was performing at Central London Polytechnic, and Chas Chandler asked if his new protege could sit in for a jam. Clapton, the reigning king of the London scene, agreed. Jimi walked onto the stage, plugged in, and launched into a version of Howlin' Wolf's Killing Floor at a tempo and volume that felt like a physical assault. He played with his teeth, he played behind his head, and he channeled a raw, primal energy that Clapton had never witnessed before. Halfway through the song, Clapton dropped his hands, walked off stage, and went into the dressing room to try and light a cigarette with trembling hands. He famously asked Chas, "Is he always that good?" The word spread through London like wildfire. There was a new king in town, and he was an American paratrooper with a Stratocaster. The formation of the Jimi Hendrix Experience followed shortly after. Chas Chandler auditioned dozens of musicians before finding Noel Redding, a guitarist who agreed to switch to bass just to play with Jimi, and Mitch Mitchell, a jazz-influenced drummer whose frantic, polyrhythmic style was the perfect match for Jimi's sonic explorations. The trio was a powerhouse. They didn't just play songs, they created immersive psychedelic landscapes. Jimi was finally free from the Chitlin Circuit constraints and the military's square peg expectations. In London, his eccentricity wasn't a flaw, it was his greatest asset. He began dressing in ornate military jackets, a subtle, ironic nod to the uniform he once hated, now worn as a symbol of his artistic liberation. However, the rapid ascent to fame brought a new set of pressures. The London press was fascinated by this Black Elvis, often using racially charged language to describe his savage and wild performances. Jimi found himself navigating a complex social minefield, being hailed as a visionary while simultaneously being treated as an exotic curiosity. The workload was punishing. They were playing multiple shows a night, recording in the early morning hours, and constantly being hounded by photographers. The ghost of the Army's 24/7 demands had returned, but this time, the stakes were his very soul. He was beginning to realize that being a legend meant losing the privacy he had struggled so hard to find. The experience was becoming a whirlwind, and Jimi was at the center of the storm, holding on to his guitar as the only thing that felt real. The whirlwind of London eventually carried Jimi back across the Atlantic, but he wasn't the same man who had left. When the Jimi Hendrix Experience took the stage at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, it was a homecoming that redefined the history of rock and roll. Having been introduced by Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, Jimi delivered a performance that was part musical mastery and part ritual sacrifice. The climax, where he knelt before his guitar and set it ablaze, was more than just a theatrical stunt. It was a symbolic purging of his past. The flames licked the air, consuming the instrument in a way that mirrored his own rapid, high-heat consumption by the industry. In that moment, the former paratrooper who had struggled to follow orders was now the commander of a global cultural revolution. Success, however, brought a relentless gravity. By 1968 and 1969, the pressures of being Jimi Hendrix began to fracture the foundation he had built. The experience was drifting apart. Noel Redding was increasingly frustrated by Jimi's perfectionism in the studio, where a single track might undergo 50 takes, and the endless cycle of touring was taking its toll. Jimi was no longer just a musician, he was a corporation, a symbol, and a target. The Black Power movement pressured him to be more politically active, while his mostly white audience demanded the wild man of Borneo persona every night. He was caught in a crossfire of expectations, much like his days in the 101st Airborne, but this time there was no discharge paper that could grant him an easy exit. His sanctuary became Electric Lady Studios in New York, a state-of-the-art facility he built to escape the ticking clock of commercial studios. There, he would spend days and nights lost in sound, often inviting dozens of strangers and fellow musicians to jam until the sun came up. He was searching for a new sound, something he called first rays of the new rising sun. He moved away from the power trio format, reuniting with his old army buddy Billy Cox to form the Band of Gypsies. This was a return to his roots, a fusion of funk, rock, and soul that felt more grounded and communal. But the industry and the fans were impatient. They wanted the hits, they wanted the fire, and they wanted the purple haze. The iconic performance at Woodstock in 1969 served as the ultimate testament to his complex relationship with his country. When he played the Star-Spangled Banner, he didn't just play a national anthem, he used his guitar to mimic the sounds of falling bombs, machine gun fire, and the screams of a generation caught in the Vietnam War. It was a sonic deconstruction of the very military machine he had once been a part of. To some, it was a desecration. To others, it was the most patriotic act of the era, a mirror held up to a fractured nation. For Jimi, it was the sound of his own internal chaos being projected onto a field in upstate New York. He was tired, his health was declining, and the drugs that once fueled his creativity were beginning to cloud his clarity. As 1970 dawned, the weight became almost unbearable. Legal battles with former managers, paternity suits, and a grueling European tour pushed him to the edge of exhaustion. He spoke frequently of wanting to start over, of moving into film or orchestral music, anything to escape the electric church he had created. He felt trapped by his own image, a prisoner of the bandana and the burning guitar. In his final interviews, there is a haunting sense of a man looking for a way home, yet realizing that the only home he truly had was within the vibrations of his strings. The paratrooper was in a permanent freefall, and the ground was approaching faster than anyone realized. The final days of Jimi Hendrix were a haunting echo of the solitude he felt back in the barracks of Fort Campbell. In September 1970, London, the city that had first embraced his genius, became the stage for his final act. He was physically exhausted, his spirit weathered by the relentless demands of fame and a string of grueling performances. On the night of September 17th at the Samarkand Hotel, the noise that had defined his life finally began to fade into a heavy, somber silence. He spent his last hours writing poetry and speaking of a future that felt increasingly distant. When the sun rose on September 18th, the world learned that the flame, which had burned twice as bright, had finally flickered out at the age of 27. The news of his passing sent shockwaves across the globe, but for those who truly knew him, like Billy Cox, it felt like the loss of a brother in arms. Hendrix had journeyed from the strict confines of the 101st Airborne to the absolute peak of artistic freedom, yet he never quite escaped the feeling of being a man out of time. He died before he could finish his final masterpiece, First Rays of the New Rising Sun, leaving behind a trail of sonic blueprints that musicians would spend the next 50 years trying to decipher. He wasn't just a rock star who died young. He was a pioneer who had pushed the limits of human expression until there was nowhere left to go. In the decades since his death, the image of Jimi Hendrix has been frozen in time. The headband, the fringed jacket, the upside-down Stratocaster. But beyond the iconography lies the story of a young man who refused to let his environment define him. The U.S. Army tried to turn him into a cog in a machine, but he used that experience to sharpen his resolve. He took the discipline of the military and applied it to his obsession with the guitar, creating a work ethic that allowed him to rewrite the rules of music in just 4 short years of global stardom. He proved that even in the most rigid systems, a creative soul can find a way to soar. Today, when we hear the soaring notes of Voodoo Child or the distorted cry of his Star-Spangled Banner, we are hearing the sound of a man who finally found his own frequency. Jimi Hendrix didn't just play the guitar, he liberated it. He transformed an instrument into a voice, and a voice into a movement. His legacy isn't just in the records he left behind, but in the courage he showed by being unapologetically himself, even when the world and the law demanded he be someone else. He remains the ultimate symbol of the screaming eagle who actually learned to fly, leaving the earth behind to live forever in the stars. The journey from Private Hendrix to the king of rock and roll was a short, turbulent flight, but its impact changed the cultural landscape forever. He showed us that our past, no matter how restrictive or difficult, is often the very forge that shapes our greatness. Jimi Hendrix didn't just survive the military, he used the friction of that life to ignite a fire that still burns in the hearts of every person who picks up a guitar and dreams of changing the world. The song ended far too soon, but the echo will never die.